This is a RodCast about RebelRod's family tree. It's an extensive one, and it goes from my father, John Ham, to my mother, Mary Donelson. And I have done quite a bit of research on the Donelson side because the Ham side was already done by my uncle, Paul Ham. So as I did it, I started out with Frances Smith, who's my grandma. And she was born in 1924, and she died in 2001. My grandpa, Jack Donelson, proper name James Donelson, was born in 1923 and died in 1969. And my grandma sort of sparked my interest in it by telling me that they didn't really keep records on her side of the family, which is the Smiths. But she said they do keep extensive records on your grandpa's side because the Donelsons are a very influential family in Tennessee. She said we used to go to the Hermitage House and they would make over it some. And she said we have a letter from Private Roy E. Smith to your grandpa that we got for your mother's first birthday. And she gave it to me. She said that the letter was sent during World War II, and we read it together and discussed it. And it's one of my favorite memories of my grandmother. So as I did my research, I went back as far as I could, and I ended up in Dublin, Ireland's prehistory, is the way it was explained, with a John Donelson. And then it went, I believe, to Robert Donelson, vice versa. And it picks up again with Franklin County, Virginia, and John Donelson Jr., who fell in love and married Rachel Stockley. And they were an interesting pair. They were very active in government, like the House of Burgesses in Virginia. And he was a land surveyor. He went around and had quite a bit of influence in the region of South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, as far as doing the state lines and claiming territory. And he was also somewhat of a tinkerer, a craftsman, if you will, and formed a furnace company right there in Franklin County, Virginia. They had 11 children and decided to take on the frontier and went through the Cumberland Gap as a family. And one of the older children, John Stockley, decided to stake claim in a place called Crab Orchard, Tennessee. And as time went on, he ended up producing children, and they ended up producing children. And it's all documented in the Knoxville genealogy departments and at Hermitage, Tennessee, as far as the Donelson family goes. My grandpa was born there, and he married Frances Smith, and they had a child on March the 6th, 1943, named Mary Gail Donelson. She was born at the Rockwood Hospital in Rockwood, Tennessee, and spent the first part of her life there in Crab Orchard. And then they moved, from what I understand, to Knoxville. And my grandmother's family, they were prosperous in Crossville, Tennessee. And Jack, my grandpa, took a job with the Knoxville, Cincinnati Trailways bus route and became one of the turnabout drivers going back and forth between Cincinnati and Knoxville on his job with Trailways Bus. He was also a mason in the area, and he was very popular because of his job, because of his personality, and of course because he was a Donelson around the area. They moved up to somewhere around Sharonville, Lockland, Ohio. From what I would gather, I would say it was around the 50s, maybe even the 60s. But she attended school at Lockland High School and met my father, John Ham, who grew up in RodCast, Kentucky, with his family, and his parents were Oscar and Molly Ham, who gave him the opportunity to go to college. He went to Cumberland College. His dad was he was sort of a tinkerer or craftsman, if you will, also. And they had a boarding house there in Lockland for quite some time. He ended up going to Vietnam and coming home and then meeting my mother, Mary Donelson, who had married and became Mary Davidson while she was married to the owner of the Sharonville Inn, Bob Davidson. And then they got a divorce, and like I said, my father had came back from Vietnam, and they met and married and produced me on June the 17th, 1972, and my brother Billy Ham on July the 4th, 1975. And they've all passed away except for my father. And so I spend a lot of time doing genealogy type stuff to better inform future generations before our history gets lost in the ever-changing and ever-paced world that we live in. John Donelson, like I said, produced 10 children, and Stockley founded Crab Orchard, Tennessee. But he had an aunt named Rachel, and Rachel ended up in a marriage to Lewis Robards in Kentucky around the Cumberland Gap. And they were married for 2 years, and then she left and took quite a journey down to Fort Nashville with her father and the rest of her family. And while there, ran into a man named Andrew and became enthralled by him, fell in love with him, and they decided to get married, and they went down to Mississippi to get their certificate. But in Mississippi, they wouldn't honor the marriage because they both had to be Catholic. And so it came to be that was a blessing, because her first husband, Lewis Roberts, didn't get the paperwork done properly, and she was still married. So when they came back to Hermitage, Tennessee, Nashville, Tennessee, they did get married. The paperwork was all filled out correctly, and he was called off to war. And he spent most of his life fighting the English in those Revolutionary Wars, and had become quite powerful with his military might, and went to New Orleans for the Battle of 1812, earning him quite the reputation for ending or concluding the War of 1812 with the English, and then went back to Hermitage to build a house and build a family and build a community with his wife when he was called by President Monroe. And President Monroe asked him to go down to Florida um, and find out what was going on because there was such a ruckus down there with the Native Americans, the Spanish, the English runaway slaves, and of course President Monroe wanted to settle things in the South so that America could be claimed and could be born. And so it wasn't like a regular trip. I mean, you didn't just hop on a train, car, and go down there. So Andrew Jackson got his horse and got his men together and made a legendary trip down through the Panhandle and into the state of Florida. And the stories are quite interesting about how all of it took place. And he was able to not only claim the land, but govern it. The citizens there considered him to be the mayor or the speaker for the state of Florida, just like he was in Tennessee. And so he became a part of something huge. Something like a mission had taken place for him, and a lot of it was out of his control. But this belief system in the United States and its conquest throughout the continent of North America was polarized in the Donelson and Andrew Jackson campaigns. So much so that they asked him to become the leader of a new party, a new belief system in this country called the Democratic Party. And so, as the leader of the party, he was also cast into a presidential election and lost. He wasn't prepared for it. But he had learned a lot. And so when he came back to Washington for his second bid as president, he took on a man named Adams. And Adams' campaign really did damage to his wife with their slander of her for being married once before, and destroyed her in the media and destroyed her in public until she had what we might consider today to be social anxiety. And she had no interest in going around strangers in Washington, D.C. She became ill. Probably the stress of the campaigns didn't help any. And she died the week that he won in his presidential bid. So she asked, according to legend, her niece, Emily Donelson, to accompany the president with her husband, Andrew Jackson Donelson, who became the first Secretary of State, if you will. And together, they took Washington by storm, really, these Donelsons and Mr. President Jackson, and began to govern an ever-developing democracy, one that was very different from the beginning of their lives, one that was moving from the frontiersman pioneer days into what we might look at as farming and manufacturing bids. And a new economy was developing, and there were many, many things going on that President Jackson and others helped us get through. He served until one day he finally went back to Hermitage to enjoy the end of his life, and was recognized as one of the great presidents, along with Emily Donelson being recognized as one of the great first ladies in Tennessee's history, as well as the United States. Thank you for tuning in. If you like this, I have many more on my RodCast on YouTube. Please like, share, and subscribe.